Okay. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the City Futures Research Centre seminar series from Dr. Billingsley. Today's seminar is being held on the traditional lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present, as well as any First Nations people joining us today. In a moment, I'm going to ask Professor Pitet to introduce our speaker today, but first some housekeeping. If you're joining online, please mute your microphone, turn off your camera during the presentation, and then when we get to the Q&A, if you'd like to turn these back on, then you're welcome to. You can also put a question into the chat. My associate Ariane will be monitoring the chat for questions. I'd now like to introduce Professor Petit, who's the Director of City Futures, to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Martin, who is an eminent scholar in housing, a Scientia Research Fellow, Senior Research Fellow, City Futures Research Centre. He has a legal background and has been spending many years focused on the rental housing market, for which he's a specialist in the research that he undertakes. Very privileged to have him talk about one of his many research projects that he's juggling at the moment, an Uhuru project, Australian Housing Urban Research Institute project, which is titled Towards an Australian Housing and Homelessness Strategy, Understanding National Approaches in Contemporary Policy. So very timely, given that the bill is currently before the Australian Parliament. So very timely presentation. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks everyone who's attending here online. I'll pay my respects first to the Bidjigal people, who are traditional owners of the lands on which UNSW sits, and so my respect to Bidjigal elders past and present and other First Nations people joining us. I'll also make a preemptive apology. My voice is going to give out quite a way through this, I think. So if things get very raspy and gravelly and shouty, it's not just because I'm worked up about this, it's not just losing my voice. As Chris said, this seminar presentation really puts into conversation some work that I and other colleagues here and at RMIT did on a national housing strategy last year, and we spoke about that at a previous seminar. Putting that into conversation with something that's very topical. Before the Parliament at the moment, there is a National Housing and Homelessness Plan bill that's been introduced by two independent parliamentarians, that has drawn on our research. So I'll be putting that background into a topical issue. He's up. There we go. So just in outline, what I'll cover today, a bit of background, and then Australian federal relations and housing policy. I'll keep a brief history, then more about the bill that's before Parliament now, and finally talking about next steps after this bill and towards a proper national housing and homelessness plan. So the background, immediate background is this Uhuru research that some colleagues and I did. It was published last year. I've already spoken at a seminar about that. You can watch the replay. It's also available on Uhuru's website. And it has directly informed the bill, as we'll see. So a couple of things that I hope will take as read for today's purposes. Taking as read that Australia does have housing and homelessness problems that require policy responses. There's capsule reviews of those problems in access to home ownership, private rental, social housing, connections with economic productivity agenda. That's all in the Uhuru research, and I'll refer you to that. The thing I'd highlight today is the complexity of these problems. Housing and homelessness problems are complex in that they cross over different policy areas and over different levels of government, and that there are many agencies that do housing policy. Despite that complexity, Australia's never had a housing and homelessness, a national housing and homelessness strategy, in the sense that is of an authoritative framework for housing policy development action. I've got one. Oh, you've got one. Stuck up. An authoritative framework for housing policy development, accountability and action. This is a bit of the lie of the land. We covered this in the early research, but I'll give you a refresher on the lie of the land of the Australian federalism and housing policy. So in the Australian Constitution, there's no mention of housing or homelessness. So those matters are clearly within the legislative powers of the states. But the Commonwealth does have powers regarding tax, banking, money, social security, and especially conditional grants that make it deeply influential on the housing system. And similar story in health and education and so many other areas. So the long trend of federal relations in Australia is of the Commonwealth expanding its power and centralising its policy leadership in so many areas. Because of the extent of those powers, those economic powers especially, that it has. And that long trend really has reinforced something that was part of federation at the very beginning, and that is that Australia's federalism is a concurrent federalism. State and federal levels of government are going to be operating in policy areas at the same time all the time. Brian Galligan was a scholar of Australian federal relations, and he said that Australia's concurrent federal system is strong on concurrency on this, both levels of government working in the same spaces, but weak on intergovernmental relations and management. And so, in particular, the Constitution doesn't specify any institutions or forums in which state and federal governments are going to conduct their intergovernmental relations. It all happens at a sub-constitutional political level, intergovernmental relations in Australia. For the last 40 years or so, the overarching theme of these political sub-constitutional intergovernmental relations has been cooperative federalism. We'll try to cooperate, whatever that might mean. And for most of that time, the main forum, the main institution for intergovernmental relations was COAG, that's the Council of Australian Governments. It had one aspect of COAG was the COAG Reform Council. That was a public-facing evaluation and accountability council that evaluated COAG's policy reform agenda and the implementation of reforms that have been worked out at COAG. And there had also been, particularly around the time of the Rudd government, and it was Rudd that really consciously elevated COAG to this policy development, intergovernmental policy development forum. There was also a discussion about a discussion within government and within academia. Lots of people doing discovery projects on Australian federalism and on how to optimally institutionalise and formalise cooperative federalism and the sort of work that was happening through COAG. All of that got massively disrupted by the Abbott government, which came up with its own federalism reform agenda that was antithetical to concurrent federalism and unproductive and didn't go anywhere, but it disrupted the conversation. By 2020, COAG survived, but the COAG Reform Council didn't. By 2020, in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, COAG was replaced by the National Cabinet. It's a similar architecture with ministerial councils underneath it. It's more secretive than COAG was, and that principles discussion of how to optimally institutionalise and what the principles of this arrangement should be is really at a low ebb. So that's where we're coming to. That's where the current government is. That's the situation that it arrives at in its intergovernmental relations with the states and territories after a period of a disruption of what had been an emerging established way. So housing policy exemplifies that long trend of Australian federalism, of the rising dominance and influence of the federal government. So just quickly, 100 years ago, we had state governments implementing on a pretty ad hoc basis public housing programs, some home ownership assistance through state banks, schemes like that. But it was really only when the federal government became involved in a big way after the Second World War in funding public housing and in so many of the other big economic institutional arrangements that promoted home ownership. That's when the housing system, that's when the public housing system as we knew it really became an established part of Australian housing policy and state government as well. And it was subsequent to that was really, again, federal policy that drove the residualisation of social housing. Was when that federal funding declined, that drove the retrenchment of the public housing system, public housing institutions, and there was also federal financial deregulation and tax reform in the later part of the 20th century too. That drove the transformation of support for home ownership into support for existing homeowners and this leveraging the existing housing wealth into an even bigger housing position and housing assetisation and the rise of private rental. So Commonwealth policy influence has grown over housing, but policy leadership, the deliberate development of housing policy hasn't really grown. In the early 90s, we did have something called a national housing strategy, not in the sense of an authoritative framework for housing policy development, action and accountability, but really it was a research agenda. In offices and libraries like ours, there's a stack of very worthy reports coming out of this, but it wasn't an authoritative framework for government action. And in any event, that was very shortly taken over by the advent of the Howard government, which had no housing minister, and housing policy was really relegated to the margins of the social security portfolio. Under Rudd, the housing minister was restored, and there was some significant but really short-lived initiatives in housing policy. The Turnbull government claimed to have a comprehensive housing affordability plan. It was on all of 3 pages. It led to be a fact sheet. Really, the highest level housing policy instrument has been this series of federal funding agreements for the social housing system. That's the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, later named the National Affordable Housing Agreement, and then the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, and now it's the National Agreement on Social Housing and Homelessness. It has made gestures at other housing policy objectives, but as the system that it is directed towards has become more and more marginalised, it isn't a very influential document on wider housing policy. And there's a quote from Productivity's most recent review of this version of the agreement, really planning it as a national housing policy instrument. So, just wrapping up the lie of the land, across federal housing agencies, these are the federal housing policy development agencies at the federal level that have a responsibility for housing development. It's fragmented, it's divided. The Department of Social Services formally has responsibility for social housing and assistance homelessness. Treasury formally has responsibility for housing supply and affordability. It got affordability formally in 2019 from DSS. The RBA and APRA really are housing policy institutions. They're the elephants in the room. That's discussed a bit more in that Bahuri report. There's also a relatively new agency, the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, now known as Housing Australia. It was an initiative of either Turnbull or Morrison, I can't remember which one actually passed the legislature, 2018. Originally a community housing finance vehicle, but it's picked up other functions, and it's got some policy capacity now across sectors. It's a similar story at the state and territories, although their institutions are a little different in that they did have these public housing authorities, the housing authorities that built the social housing system. They used to be standalone. They got merged, most of them, into other bigger departments, especially in the 90s. Some of them are starting to re-emerge as standalone entities now, but they don't have planning, land assembly, residential tenancy responsibilities. Those the NAHA and NHHA have made it's been a condition of those funding agreements that states have a state level housing strategy. That requirement was not made at the Commonwealth, but states have had to have them. They're of very uneven quality. So the overall story is that housing policy responsibilities are fragmented and divided at both levels of government. Now we get to the Albanese government. That's the lie of the land that this government that took office in 2022 confronted them, and it made several housing policy commitments coming into office, including elevating the cabinet minister elevating the housing minister to cabinet, re-establishing a housing advisory body, that's the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, re-establishing MIFIC as Housing Australia, reflecting the wider remit that it was picking up, and a couple of set pieces like the Housing Australia Future Fund, which is a bespoke funding arrangement for social and affordable housing, some first home buyer assistance programs, Help to Buy, and a national housing and homelessness plan. um, which has subsequently been pitched as a 10-year plan that is across, sets out a vision across levels of government, across different policy areas. Early on, the NAAHP was allocated to the DSS, Department of Social Services, which isn't a strong place to develop a really systemic housing and homelessness plan. It wasn't even 6 months after the government took office that another previously unheralded thing, the National Housing Accord, was announced, and it has some distinctly plan-like attributes. It's still a short document, but it purports to be an agreement between the Commonwealth and states and territories, and also representatives of finance and development sectors. It set a target that at the time was 1 million new dwellings in 5 years. That later got increased to 1.2 million. It also sets out some commitments, high-level commitments about facilitating institutional investment in social and affordable housing. And its Treasury has the responsibility for the Accord. They've negotiated, Treasury's negotiated some implementation schedules with state governments, and these really just record some planning reforms and state level social housing funding programs that states have either already announced or they have. So while DSS has been working on its plan, we've also had new developments in the housing policy agenda. In 2023, after a meeting of the National Cabinet, the government announced a national planning reform blueprint. It's a 10-point blueprint. Some of the points really are just perennial planning things, like undertaking planning reforms and promoting medium and high density housing. To the extent that it's had any follow-up, it's really just those implementation. What has been spelled out in the implementation schedule? States have just said, yeah, we're doing this, we're thinking of doing that. That's been the extent of follow-up. Same meeting also produced a tenancy law reform agenda called Better Deal for Renters. That's 9 points, 9-point reform agenda, including reasonable grounds for eviction, which is a critical reform, and also the phasing in of minimum standards, including hot and cold running water, which is all, I mean, that's what we've already got, and it's a bit of a problem if governments don't think that's already law. And there's been no follow-up. That's just been left to, that's over to the states now and left to the states. So apparently an agenda conceived in haste and without a whole lot of thought and no follow-up. Meanwhile, DSS continues its development of the NAAHP. It produced a very narrow and inadequate issues paper. It doesn't mention tax, it doesn't mention finance. Just great. It doesn't mention populational migration. It's just vast areas of policy relevant to housing just doesn't get mentioned in it. There were then these community consultations. There's a Peter Mars in Inside Story wrote them up, and it's evocative of the grim, frustrated tone that these consultations had. It's still unpublished, that plan. So we're now into the third year of the Albanese government and still unpublished. Earlier this year, there was an open letter from more than 100 housing experts, academics, including Hal and myself and others in City Futures, but also people in the community sector, in industry, former politicians on both sides, calling for a stronger legislative approach. So, and that's what's being produced. So in June, Kylie Tink and David Pocock in tandem introduced the National Housing and Homelessness Plan bill to the House of Reps and the Senate, respectively. And that's now been referred to a Senate committee, which is taking submissions through to the end of next week. So if you're thinking of doing a submission, there's still time. And it'll report by 10 October. Now, as I said, they're independent parliamentarians. So to become law, this bill needs government support. And look, the track record of private members' bills throughout Federation is that 19 out of 20 of them do not get up. So let's not expect that. But they can push governments to do better, and they can plant a seed that a government might like to take that bit of legislation for its as a model for something it itself will do. The bill has 4 substantive parts, and I'll go through them. The first part of the bill, the most important part of part 1, is that it sets out the objects of the legislation, and that's in there. Section 3 on the right, that's cut and paste. And as you can see, they've got a human rights focus. And there are 2 main reasons. As I said, Hal and I briefed the MPs on drafting it. So I'm speaking from that perspective. There are 2 main reasons for that, for the human rights focus. One is to establish that the Commonwealth does have constitutional authority to make this legislation. So we're relying on the external affairs power and its connection with international human rights obligations. There's a precedent for that in the NIFIC legislation from the previous government. It also relied on external affairs and the by SESCA to establish NIFIC originally. The second reason, and it's no less practical a reason, is that from the research we did, talking to policy practitioners, human rights are a useful starting point for conversations with the diverse agencies involved in housing policy. A way of getting them on the same page and also of guiding coordinated policy. The reference to those human rights obligations and housing as the right to adequate housing as a human right in this legislation doesn't create a housing right that can be litigated by individuals. So I think that would be a good thing, but it doesn't happen in this bill. That would be a job for another piece of legislation like a National Human Rights Act. Part 2 of the bill is really all about that's where the plan is addressed, the NHP. And the key thing about it is that it creates an obligation. It's about obligations mostly. So creating an obligation on the housing minister to prepare a 10-year plan. The preparations have to be collaborative. So that means considering advice from certain advisory bodies and also considering information from civil society organisations and people who have the legal need of housing need and homelessness. It also obliges the housing minister to make progress reports once every 3 years, once every parliament, and to revise in the 9th year and make another plan, another 10-year plan after that. It also nominates Housing Australia as the lead agency to clarify who is the agency that will be assisting the minister in making the plan. And as I said, it's mostly about obligations on the minister. It doesn't create new powers with regards to individual persons or with regards to the states. That outline is straight from them. So still on part 2, section 8 is addressed to the content of the plan. But as you can see, the way it addresses the content of the plan is it sets out certain rights-informed outcomes. It doesn't set out policy details or program details. These are really for the minister on behalf of the government to commit to. So the bill itself, as I've said there, doesn't say the plan must be to abolish negative hearing. The government could choose to make that part of its plan, but the bill doesn't prescribe those sorts of decisions for the government. And one government could take a more market-oriented approach to its housing policy and to its plan, and another government could take an approach that is more about public provision of housing, and that's decisions for the government. The bill makes clear that the plan is not a legislative instrument. It's not a type of law. It's not itself a law. So it wouldn't change the plan itself. It's not a way of changing the law. If a government was minded to include in its plan something like, we will get rid of negative hearing, the plan itself wouldn't do that. The government would have to go back to the parliament in the usual way and try to make an amendment to the Income Tax Assessment Act. There's also nothing in the bill would prevent a minister from revising or replacing the plan before the 10 years. Just that any plan that they might put in place has to be collaborative, have that 10-year time frame that gets them looking beyond the next election, and be directed to these outcomes. Part 3 and Part 4 both establish new advisory agencies. So Part 3 is about establishing a national housing consumer council. It's a consumer voice counterpart to the industry expert voice of National Housing Supply and Affordability Council. It'd provide advice and input into the making of the plan, but also be able to feed up to the minister emerging housing issues that it picks up through its membership, and its membership would be required to include people with lived experience, housing need, disability, homelessness, and Indigenous persons. Part 4 would establish a National Housing and Homelessness Advocate, and that's an independent government officer who would, like the council, be a source of advice to the minister in preparing the plan, but also have an accountability responsibility. And that the accountability function, that is monitoring implementation of the plan and making annual progress reports and conducting reviews of systemic housing issues, including in response to submissions by members of the public. So the functions and powers of that office don't include conducting reviews or investigations into individual housing problems, but receive submissions and then conduct a general inquiry into an issue. That, like other aspects of the bill, this one has a close counterpart in Canadian legislation. Canada has a national housing strategy, and shortly after it established its strategy, it gave it a statutory basis, like this bill would outline. and it included an advocate. The trouble with the Canadian approach was that they did these things after the plan commenced. Their national housing strategy wasn't great checks to start with, and they got these institutions like the advocate on board really 5 years after the 10-year plan commenced. So, as I say, the bill is with the Senate Economics Legislation Committee now. Feel free to make a submission to it. The details are there. And we'll get a report back by 10 October. Next, what happens after that? Well, it could be that the government's own plan will appear. But let's see how it stacks up. The bill gives us a bit of a framework for considering just how it stacks up and where it falls short. As I said earlier, the indicators are not promising. But if such a thing does come up without the statutory scheme of the bill behind it, perhaps the government can be persuaded to present it as a provisional plan. It's going to pending a proper plan with a more systemic housing system-wide view that has a statutory basis. So, if such a thing appears, and we're encouraging the government to call it a provisional plan, here's a couple of recommendations for things that it could be doing to prepare for a wider ranging, properly made, a genuine national housing loan business plan. And this gives you a bit of an idea of what the content of the plan could be. So engaging, first of 4 points, the Minister could engage National Housing Supply Affordability Council to conduct a national unmet housing need assessment along the lines of an activity that my City Futures colleagues have conducted over the last couple of years, again, a couple of stages. But let's see a new national unmet housing need assessment taken. 3 other pieces of work that I think would be useful to prepare a plan. The Minister, and this comes back to that, the federal, the intergovernmental relations and our federal structure. The Minister engages one of the ministerial councils, the Council on Federal Financial Relations, which involves the treasurers, to convene 3 working groups, one on housing taxation, one on housing regulation, and another on housing assistance, and look at state and federal policy settings under each of those topic headings. None of those things have been properly countenanced in the DSS process. All of them could do with a process of information gathering from relevant stakeholders, from working up some options for policy development, and in the genuine plan that we hope takes shape. The plan could either set forward the government's preferred policy development options, or if it's not to go that far, it could set out further steps for a more for further investigation in a more detailed way of policy development options in those 3 areas. There's a model for that, for that sort of working group, that council previously, prior to the establishment of kinetic and affordable housing working group, that did a good job on this sort of analysis in preparation for the establishment. So it's a thing that can be done within that federal relations architecture that we have. And with this accountability around it, accountability to the Australian Parliament, to the Australian people, we might in housing policy be starting to set a bit of an example for the way policy development in the Australian Federation. I'll leave it there. I'll take questions.
Well, thank you very much for a very informative and very important topic talk. So thank you very much. So we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Yeah, you go first. Thanks, Chris. That was great. For what it's worth, we stole our ideas from the Canadian example, which seems to be you've done. So having something like that, having Supply and Affordability Council take carriage of it would parallel the Canadian example. I'm assuming that's where that's come from. So that's all good. My question is about the advocate role and how that would slot in with other ad hoc, and I like the idea of an advocate being, built for purpose, but we've got other ad hoc ways that sort of monitoring, like an audit office or productivity mentioned, or even like roles, and we have other things that exist. So how would it slot into those other sort of monitoring roles?
Well, the bill would give it an annual a responsibility for annual reports on the plan. So it'd be tied into the plan, progress of the plan. And then would have this other investigative function that can bring up new issues for information. I think the benefit of it is that it is a specialist, as you pointed out, I think that it's a specialist agency, and we do have some other agencies that from time to time take an interest in housing policy, and you mentioned Productivity Commission, which has returned to housing policy on quite a few occasions. It brings a particular view of the world to its reviews, and it would be good to have another one in this specialist office.
I've got kind of two related questions for you, Chris. Number one, if the government goes with the sort of provisional plan only and doesn't adopt the genuine plan, what do you think the consequences will be, number one, or the outcomes? And number two, maybe this is asking you to speculate on things you don't know, but what would be their motivations and reasons for not adopting this? Like, why is this already not the plan? Because it sounds very good.
Yeah. The plan, look, currently there has been a draft of the plan. I haven't seen it, but there's been a draft of the plan around for some months, and it went to a housing ministerial council, and the communication out of the council, a media release afterwards, said the states look forward to working with the Commonwealth on its draft plan.
Okay.
So there's a strong vibe.
Still got a bit of work to do.
This isn't good.
Yeah.
And that is consistent with the shocking issues and the summary. I've also what we know publicly. There's a consultation summary, that just shows the thinness and the meagerness of what was up for conversation. So what comes out of that? It could be as bad as the worst of the state strategies. New South Wales has a particularly bad one, which is a brochure. It's a brochure of existing housing programs, things the government's already doing, and then a bunch of little boxes that talk about what the community housing sector is doing with the not enough money that it has. That's what the plan could look like. And for a government that came to office promising something more, it would end up with having done rather less than the government. And I mean, that's where they're at with housing policy. And if they don't take on a more ambitious housing agenda and circumstances that are a bit different for this government as well. If they don't take on a bit more ambition and accountability, they may not get much more time in office for a government DP. That's my speculation.
Thank you. I just wanted to draw quickly his attention because Hal Forson has actually also put some points, sort of compliment points to what you've been saying in the chat. So I just wanted people to sort of recognise this as just like additional resource on the topic in case Hal wants to add anything himself. But meanwhile, to me, this private members bill, it looks quite light touch. It's not binding future governments. They could always come up with their own policy. It seems quite possible. I'm just wondering why you're so hesitant to suggest that this won't actually get passed. What is it in there that's so controversial?
Well, I mean, is that I don't want people to get their hopes unrealistically raised because there is legislation before the Parliament. It is kind of exciting for people like us. But on the other hand, it hasn't come from the government. So, and the governments like to set their own agenda. So we need to be realistic about the prospects of it, that it doesn't get up without government ownership of it. Very, very occasionally, the 5% they get from New South Wales Residential Parks Act. 1998 it was a private members bill in the first place. The government decided like that's not good. That does happen, but it is a genuine attempt at showing a government how this could be done, and it's not about showing government up. It is about a framework that would allow governments to set their own plan, but in a kind of an old-fashioned way to require them to be accountable for it, more accountable than they have been, more accountable than the history of the erratic engagements in housing policy by federal government. And I think that accountability theme, that should appeal to old-fashioned parliamentarians as much as having an ambitious housing agenda should appeal to, interested people like us, but also an increasingly interested wider public.
Do you see that the problem is actually getting worse? This housing issue, the problem, and is that going to bring about political will to actually? Should we be optimistic something's going to be done?
Well, I'll use this as an example. It's my special subject, tenancy law, and I've mentioned the better deal for renters. So there's, on the one hand, the better deal for renters agenda. It reflects that there is at the moment an uncommon amount of tenancy law reform that is taking place at state level and across the states. And there are some big improvements being made. And just last weekend, the New South Wales government committed in a bit more detail than it has previously to abolishing without grounds terminations, which is the first point in the better deal for renters. And from what it has said publicly, the further details it's given, they're good. It'd be abolishing them for during a tenancy and also during a periodic tenancy, but also at the end of the fixed term tenancy. So that's very welcome. There's a bunch of other things that need to be addressed in our tenancy law as well. Over the last few years, when there has been quite a bit of movement, there's been different approaches taken and really quite significant convergences opening up. And there's no coordination of that. And the fact that it got onto the National Cabinet's agenda was encouraging, but then they came up with this seriously mixed bag of 9 items, including the hot and cold running water thing. And it just shows how, like, it's that all photo op, no follow up thing that this government criticised its predecessor. That was the line it used against its predecessor. And that's what better deal for renters is. That was photo op, no follow up. And the divergent approaches, it wasn't even 2 weeks later that after that WA said, well, we won't be doing no grounds reform. That coordination hasn't happened. So I'm talking, one hand and on the other hand when I answer your question about are things getting better. But there are signs of that, but also there isn't this program of reform addressing all the other things that did make the point that I think we shouldn't be on there instead of some of the stuff.
I think we've got somebody asking a question online. I think it's Peter Tulip, I'm not sure. He's raised his hand, so maybe he'd like to come online to ask.
Sure. I hope you can hear me.
You're muted, Peter.
No, well, that might be by you. I've got my microphone on. I have my microphone free.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
You go in the far right corner.
Hello, can you hear me now? Yeah, I'm talking, but okay, I don't think this is working. Sorry.
I can hear you well.
Just hold on a minute.
We can hear you online.
Okay, the people online can hear me, but the people in the room apparently can't.
Sorry, it's muted our side. Sorry about that.
Okay, so you can hear me now, everyone?
You need to
I just can't see it.
Sorry.
Yeah.
down to the left. Down to the left.
To the left.
To the left.
There you go. Yeah.
Down.
Oh, no, back to the right. Yes.
Yeah, click.
Yes.
Housing policy is difficult.
Can you guys make me now?
So can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Chris, my question is I like the idea, but there are lots of noble ideas out there that we'd like to end racial discrimination, we'd like to end poverty, we'd like world peace. I'm wondering why housing is different to those other objectives. My guess is that there's not agreement on a cost-effective instrument that will deliver, an end to crime or an end to racial discrimination. And so mandating these noble objectives isn't really worthwhile. But I'm curious as to how you see, providing housing for everyone at an affordable rate is different to all those other objectives.
I don't think it is. I think all of those other objectives are, for what it's worth, they're listed out as obligations of states to progressively realise, well, either to progressively realise or to make happen right now, because they are rights inherent to our humanity. So I don't think housing's not different. It's one of that set, and it's.
But for example, we don't have a national plan to end crime or a national plan to end poverty.
Well, on the contrary, we've had national drug strategies, for instance, that have set out approaches and set an overarching themes for addressing drug offending. Those plans have changed over time. It came up when we've got a national disability reform agenda. And that was something we looked at in some detail in the Ahuri research. I have a recollection when we did that we also saw a national feral cat strategy. But there are strategies, as I say, authoritative frameworks for developing, acting, and being accountable for government action that organise intergovernmental relations in our federation. And we do that in a bunch of policy areas already, because we do have two levels of government that do operate in so many policy areas at the same time. So it's not different. There's a bunch of these documents, more or less successful, that purport to coordinate activity over the levels of government, and they can have different flavours. Again, the national drug strategy has moved over time between a very public health harm minimisation approach to something that does get a bit more, that has in recent versions had more of an emphasis on law enforcement. That's not a positive development, but it does show how governments of the day can choose to change the terms of strategies over time.
Okay.
Do you have any more?
Question. And this is an educate me question. So I always struggle to understand how national strategies then trickle down to states, and then what happens from there. How would the case of that happen in, like, for the National Housing Homelessness Plan? Like, what would be the kind of fallout, so to speak?
Okay, so that can be tricky. So one example of that is the social housing funding agreements that have from time to time placed other obligations or requirements, including states have to have a housing strategy. Or there was one previously about, in my special subject, there was a improving private rental tenure security. But there's so often no follow-up. And that's what Productivity Commission saying that. So how do we get follow-up and requiring the minister in the first place to make a plan with a longer view, and then to report on progress every 3 years, and to have another agency of government coming back every year reporting on progress as well. Hopefully that supports the follow-up. It currently doesn't.
Okay, well, it is actually a bit up 5, so we may need to have an end there. So I would like to thank our speaker one more time. Thank you very much. Our next seminar is going to be on the 9th of August, just 1 week away, which will be an 8-hour seminar. And meanwhile, I want to wish everyone a nice weekend.